as I said yesterday, it's a great program. Today we had several discussions on social policies and economic policies and consequences in terms of educational outcomes and the effects of voicing of policymakers for lockdowns. Now I come with a strictly globally financial topic, which is global, but where I will put some emphasis also on the case of Latin America, of course. Okay, before taking you through the presentation, I will provide you already with the results. First, this is work I have been doing on the inequality of the global financial safety net in developing countries and emerging markets, together with Larissa Mühlich, also from the FU Berlin, and William Kring from Boston University, and in the earlier version also Kevin Gallagher has been involved, and he has been involved in setting up this project. I will tell you later what is the global financial safety net, but can already provide you with the, oops, do you still see my full screen? Or is it covered in part? Christian, you see my full screen? Okay, good.
Yeah, you can see it.
Okay, so I will provide you first, after an introduction, with the definition of global financial safety net and show you that this significantly evolved over time, but it's still underfunded and underused. Second,
now you're muted, Barbara.
okay. Yep.
Okay, you're unmuted. We lost the last minute.
Okay. Second, we found that the global financial safety net does not serve in the crisis. It's not much used. Third, we draw the conclusion from that the quality of lending, especially of the IMF, has to improve. And fourth, the cooperation between the IMF and regional funds has to be improved. But at the same time, regional fund the next 15 minutes, 18 minutes or so. Okay. Trying to move here. Okay. So first I will, before I start with the GFSN, I give you an introduction in the topic. First, what is the current situation in the COVID-19? We have two sets of countries. My screen is still full with other stuff. Okay, so we have two groups of countries in principle. One are the types of countries when we talk about their international financial situation and their debt situation. There are countries which are faced with a debt level which is unsustainable. So they have insolvency problems. They are not able, not even in short, but also not in the long term to serve their debt. For these, the global financial community set up a very small mechanism, the debt service suspension initiative of the G20 for the very poor countries for a rather limited amount of money. And there's in the establishing a common framework of the G20, but it is thought to be too small. And this aims at reestablishing debt sustainability and the ability to react. We here with the global financial safety net focus much more on countries with sustainable debt, which have liquidity problems, which means that at the long term, they are able or will be probably able to serve their debt, their external debt, which they owe to banks, to other financial actors, to states, to whomever, but at the short term, they face a liquidity problem because markets are not willing to lend them anymore. And for these, the global financial safety net represents a kind of insurance, not willing to lend them at a certain moment. And this liquidity can help in this COVID-19 crisis to reestablish the ability of countries to react to health issues, to provide social protection, and to preempt business and labor from major losses. Okay. When we look on the current debt situation, this is not data from our own project, but from the Jubilee debt campaign. They map the world in different colors, where that dark red means that countries are in real trouble. They are facing an open debt crisis, while the clearer red in the orange and the yellow mean that these are countries which are in risk of facing an external debt crisis, being it considered public or private debt or both. And you see that while in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, we have many countries already facing acute debt problems. In Latin America, we have high variety, but many countries facing future problems, probably also Mexico, but also Brazil. Argentina is in trouble, and Ecuador is in a current debt crisis. Okay. We saw yesterday by Guido Neidhammer, for example, when we look on Latin America here, this is a global map showing how much national states have spent to cope with COVID. The green here, and this is in Europe and the US, Canada, etc. So the OECD countries shows countries which have spent more than 10% of their GDP in anti-cyclical measures of all kinds, and the red ones are below 2.5%. Here in Latin America, as Guido showed yesterday, we have a huge variety of the level of spending. Mexico figuring among the countries with very little public spending. We all know this is necessary, would be necessary, but we also see Central American countries are on the lower bound also in terms of public spending against the crisis. When we now, this is the last one, look on fiscal policies and the change of fiscal policy stance between 1 year and the other, I take here the data from the IMF, where the IMF has compared for advanced economies, for emerging markets, and for low-income countries. There, let me see, there's also always part of my screen is covered. So, which ones have expanded and which ones have tightened their fiscal budget over the years. We can see that while emerging markets, many of them last year have expanded their budget, this year it's to be expected that most of them will start tightening their fiscal budget, and with the least developing countries also. This is not because the crisis is softening, but because these countries are suffering fiscal pressure and fearing pressure from external accounts, and fearing that international investors will withdraw their investment and their capital if countries continue spending high. Okay, this is the current state of how countries are and how many countries might come into liquidity needs in the next future. Now, in the next step, I will define for you, show you what we understand as the global financial safety net and what is its involvement over time. It started as a very simple institution in the aftermath of the Second World War, the IMF being the only institution to provide short-term liquidity for countries in balance of payment problems. In the until the beginning of this century, it already went bigger and a bit more complex, because next to the IMF, also regional financial arrangements, RFAs, entered into the game, providing to their neighboring countries also short-term liquidity, which is the Fondo Latinoamericano de Reservas, the Arab Monetary Fund, both of them created in the 70s, and the Jamai Initiative created in the 90s. Now we come to today, and you see it's big. It grew enormously, and it got much more complex. We do not only have a big IMF, 1 trillion lending capacity, we also have a high number of regional funds now, Europe, I show later in some other regions, new regional funds came up. And we have a new element, which are bilateral swap arrangements between central banks. And while the IMF and RFAs join $1 trillion lending capacity, swaps are even bigger. They join 1.5 trillion. What are swaps? Swaps are bilateral agreements between two central banks which agree upon a certain defined sum to be lent to the other country in their own currency. So country A in currency A to country B and reverse, and they settle this, and from that moment on, the other country can request that sum whenever it wants, without any condition, discussion, etc. Most swaps are provided by the Federal Reserve and the Chinese People's Bank of China, but also by a range of other countries. Okay, what we learned from that is the global financial safety net became very big and very complex, and by far the IMF now today is the only one to provide liquidity. Okay, when we assess this big and complex new global financial safety net, we find that there are significant inequalities in the provision of this kind of insurance in terms of short-term liquidity. We looked here first at the lending capacity of the three elements of the global financial safety net provided to income groups and to regions. And here, beyond our color code of red RFAs, blue swaps, we introduced for the IMF two sub-color codes, the dark green being the standard conditional lending arrangements, and the clear green being non-conditional IMF lending, which is mostly of new type, like the rapid finance instrument and other lines, which are rather small, but come without the standard conventional conditionalities. And what we see when we look first at the income classes is that most of the lending of all elements of the global financial safety net is concentrated towards high and upper middle income countries in terms of GDP, of relative GDP. These are not total sums, absolute sums. While lower and low middle income countries are much less insured in relative terms to their GDP. When we look on the regions, we see that Europe and East Asia are the regions which are most well insured, while Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, and Latin America are the group which is much less covered by all of these elements. Okay, so having this inequality, we now will look on the current use of the global financial safety net. And this is a project called the Global Financial Safety Net Tracker.com. You will find it in the internet, which is an interactive tracker, online, free, which tracks the lending capacity in annual terms from the IMF, from central banks in terms of swaps, and from regional financial arrangements. And it also tracks the current amount lent by these elements to countries. When you go on the website, you will see this colored map where you can see, for example, that many of the African countries have mostly received IMF lending during crisis, while, for example, the big Latin American countries, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, have received swap arrangements. Mexico and Brazil from the US, from the Federal Reserve, Argentina from China, and so on. You can, for example, also, what you can do is you can hover, you can hover over the countries. And when you click on Mexico on this map, I do not do it because it could be slow here in the current presentation. When you click on Mexico, you can see that Mexico got this swap from the Federal Reserve, which was extended from July to December and renewed again in March over $60 billion. And you can do this for all countries. You have also a table, you have historical views, you can see here on the lower bound, the lending over time by the different elements, etc. So you can play around a lot with this online tracker. Our first evaluation, tracking current data from February 2020 to March 2021, looking at all these elements for all developing and emerging market countries, and also including on the map Europe and all the advanced economies, we can see that first, you see the blue is dominating. Swaps play the game. Most lending has been offered, or potential lending has been offered by central banks to other central banks. But again, this is highly concentrated on high and middle income countries, and much less to lower and low income countries. We also see that from its 1 trillion lending capacity, the IMF has lent 108 billion, 10% of its available funds. So rather little, low demand by the IMF, and for regional financial arrangements, the demand is even lower. From their 1 trillion lending capacity, only 3.8 billion have been requested. When we look at the geographical distribution, we come to the same as before. East Asia and Europe are well covered with swaps, rather well covered, while Latin America has some swaps. I showed you the big member countries and all the big countries, and also Chile, but most other countries are relying on IMF lending, most of it unconditional, right? Small non-conditional credit lines. While Sub-Saharan Africa have almost exclusively received IMF lending. So in its active use, it's again highly unequal. As a last step, I will tell you about the role of the regional funds under COVID-19. The role of regional funds has been the starting point, or the pre-starting point of this tracking project, where together with Larissa Mühlich, I looked in several papers on the role of regional funds in the global financial safety net. We track here the 6 major regional funds which join developing countries and emerging markets. One is the Fondo Latinoamericano de Reservas in Latin America. The other one is the Arab Monetary Fund. These two have been created in the 1970s and are of rather small volume. The SARC arrangement is a swap arrangement of the Indian Central Bank with poorer neighboring countries. The CMIM is the Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization, what started as the Arab Monetary Fund and now is a big regional fund. And similar thing is the Contingent Reserve Agreement between BRICS countries, China, South Africa, India, Brazil, and Russia. These two, the Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization and the current Contingent Reserve Agreement, are linked to the IMF in some way. They both agreed that countries only can access liquidity from this fund if they want to have more than 30 or 40% of their country quota, if they have an IMF agreement activated. So they depend themselves on IMF cooperation. And then last, we have the Eurasian Fund for Stabilization and Development. This is similar to the SARC, which is dominated by India, a regional fund which is dominated by Russia. In terms of use in the past, what we saw were 3 groups. Were 3 groups. These older and rather small regional mechanisms, the FLAR and the AMF, have been very much in use over all the decades, very much demanded by countries, even if volume was sometimes rather small, but constantly requested. The two mechanisms which are linked to the IMF, the CMMM and the Contingent Reserve Agreement, never have been used. And the literature agrees in pointing to the link with the IMF as the responsible variable for the non-use of these regional funds, while those two, the Indian-centered SARC and the Russian-centered FSD, have been used, but countries also have been drawing constantly on swaps on the IMF, so they have done everything among the countries of these funds, but also using their funds. Okay, when we go, yeah, I'm almost finished, Christian. Thank you. So my last slide for the conclusion. When we look on the use of the regional funds in the current COVID crisis, we have a pattern which is similar to the one before, but with some changes. We look here for the member countries of these 6 agreements and what they did draw on in terms of our GFSN liquidity. And we see, again, the CRA and CMMM have not been used, no red in these bars. There is a dominance of bilateral swaps. Here, for example, especially from the Chinese central bank, but also for other central banks, and the same for the BRICS-related, I am sorry, this is happening without me, for the BRICS-related agreement. When we go to this group, we see that in the SARC, in the Eurasian Fund and the Arab Monetary Fund, we see use of the regional funds, in part in combination with the IMF or in combination with the swap. But they're used, and there is other use also, a dominance by the IMF and a strong presence of non-conditional lending by the IMF, while the FLAR this time has not been used. Against its past history of intensive request and continuous use has not been requested, but the FLAR members, which are Ecuador and Colombia and Peru and Bolivia and Venezuela and some other countries, smaller, mostly Indian countries, have mostly relied on IMF non-conditional lending. There's one lending operation pending with Ecuador, which has not come to terms since last year. Okay, concluding. We see that the multilateral institutions within the global financial safety net, which is the IMF and the regional funds, are in rather or very little use until now. It might be that this is the calm before the storm. We all know that emerging markets are not drawing on the GFSN at this moment because they are, not all of them, but many of them are flooded by liquidity from advanced economies, because the Federal Reserve and other key central banks are really providing high levels of liquidity to the markets, and they are looking for profits in other places because interest rates are so low in advanced economies. But this might change. We know that. Interest rates will be raised at some point. The Federal Reserve announced it would do it in 23, but maybe it will seize down its liquidity provision even earlier. Uncertainties of markets might increase. So it might be that we see a calm before the storm, that markets will change their sentiments towards emerging markets, developing countries, and will at some moment, for some reason, withdraw this liquidity. And then we will see that many countries, I showed you in the beginning, the map of countries in risk of a debt crisis, will suffer at least liquidity problems and significant liquidity problems. And then it might be that poorer countries and poorer regions, which are underinsured, I showed you the huge inequality, might have a lack of provision of liquidity. Second, we have shifting weights. we have this huge and enormous dominance bilateral swap arrangements, something which is not very visible. Few people really talk about that. It's not in presence neither of the press, of the media, nor of most policymakers. But the issue with these bilateral swap arrangements is that the will to provide these bilateral arrangements depends on national interests. These often are of economic interests, trade links, financial links, but also of geostrategical interests. And you never know, as a country receiving a swap from the Federal Reserve or from the Chinese central bank, if this will be renewed or not, because this is bound to non-rules. It's absolutely discretionary. So we do not know how reliable this network is. And it might be that we see something like a new liquidity diplomacy similar to what we discuss as the vaccine diplomacy, where specific countries have been providing in the last month to specific other countries vaccination shots in larger or smaller sums, depending on their political interests and their will to shape the global map. And it seems that behind that, we also have a map of liquidity diplomacy, which might be crowding out the IMF and regional funds. So what would be necessary to change this deinstitutionalization and demultilateralization of the global financial safety net? One issue certainly, and Juan Carlos Moreno raised that point already in the discussion yesterday, the IMF needs further reform. It's a significantly changed IMF we see now than 10, 15, 20 years ago, but still you see this lack of demand for standard conditionality linked IMF credit. So it seems the IMF has to do much more homework here. Second, there's a discussion which is close to its political end to increase the lending volume of the IMF in terms of increasing its special drawing rights, its kind of own currency. But even if the IMF raises its lending volume, most of this would go in terms of country quota to advanced economies. So there would be a necessity to redistribute these special drawing rights and the IMF lending quota to poorer countries, especially to middle and lower income countries. And third, if the IMF and the regional funds want to play a role in the global financial safety net and in the support of countries running into liquidity problems, they need to cooperate. But they need to cooperate in a way that the independence and the strategic advantages of regional funds in terms of closeness to their regional members, in terms of different conditionalities, different working mechanisms and different voting mechanisms needs to be maintained, because it seems to be a strong interest of countries to have created these regional mechanisms because they were unsatisfied with the governance of the global IMF. Okay, with that I end, and thank you for the attention.
Thanks a lot, Barbara. Again, as yesterday, I would ask you to save your comments for the end, so then have a discussion over all three presentations. So we can first go with the other two presentations. I see Luis solved his internet problems. I just titled my internet just went for 5 minutes or so, so I missed part of Barbara's talk. I'm not the only one who has these issues. So so we could go with Luis next, because Raymundo, I think he has not yet, he's not yet here. So we go back in order with Luis, Monroy, Gómez next. Luis has he studied economics at UNAM, right? So he's one of us, carrying still Pumas in his heart, I guess. Did then his master in economics at Colegio de México, and is now finishing his PhD at City University of New York, where he also teaches courses. He has several publications in peer-reviewed journals. He has also published a lot for broader audience, such as Revista Nexus and others, and well, has made himself quite a name as a researcher and also a respected and sought-after voice in Mexico, especially on topics of inequality of opportunities and social mobility. And today he's going to present a paper on early evidence on gender-related differences in terms of labor market impacts of COVID. Right? So again, it's like if you could try to stick to 15 to 20 minutes, that would be fantastic. So
yeah,
you have the floor.
Just let me set the clock. Okay. But thank you very much for the invitation to the seminar. It has been an amazing time hearing all these provocative presentations, some of them more depressing than others. But I guess it's kind of what we do now, trying to analyze the effects of such a generalized crisis and shock as the pandemic. As Christian said, I'm going to talk about the effects of the COVID-19 shock on the Mexican labor market, putting special attention to the differences between the impact experienced by men and the impact experienced by women in the labor market. So just as a motivation, you might have heard, particularly those of you who have been reading the news on developed countries, that this recession is called a she-cession, in the sense that women are more heavily affected by the current dislocation of the labor market, in part due to the simultaneous dislocation of the care market. By care market, we refer to the services provided by schools and other institutions that help with the care work in the household. Given the social norms that tend to put a heavier weight of care work on women's shoulders, the dislocation of the private care market or the public sector's care services has led to a rearrangement of how the care work is distributed inside households. And what has been observed in the case of developed countries is that women are facing the brunt of this shock in terms of care work and are being pulled out of the labor market in general. And one can always ask the question of, well, are we observing the same type of pattern in a developing country? And one thing that makes the Mexican case particularly interesting is that Mexico is one of the countries in Latin America. I think it's, well, last year was the second to last economy with the lowest female labor force participation rate in the whole continent. And this is kind of a puzzle that has been intriguing labor economists since it was detected in the early 2000s, particularly because we do not think that gender stereotypes are more heavily enforced in Mexico compared to other countries in Latin America, and we do not have a clear explanation of why labor force participation of women in Mexico is such below the average in Latin America. So we are starting from a very low point in that sense. And another thing that we have to have in mind is that during the last decade, this problem was starting to be solved. As more women were entering the labor market, we also have a situation where women have a higher educational attainment with respect to men. So they were entering the market and they were predominantly more educated than women. And it seems that the pandemic, if the pattern that we were observing in the developed countries is also being replicated in Mexico, that will have set us back at least a decade in terms of labor force participation. So the intention of this paper is to evaluate if it's true that we are observing the same type of dynamic in Mexico that we are observing in other developed countries. Just to remind you, I'm taking some of the papers that were presented yesterday of what has been the evolution of COVID-19 in Mexico. The first case was detected in the first days of February of last year. Community transmission, which implies that we were no longer able to track an external transmitter of the virus, was detected on March 24 of the same year, and a national lockdown was implemented from April to June 2020. This is important because we will expect that this national lockdown will be the largest distortion or the largest shock on the operation of the labor market. However, and I will talk about this a little bit more later, this also lead to changes in the way labor market statistics were recorded, and it is not possible to compare the results of this period with those of before and after the national lockdown. And as Eva Arceo presented yesterday, and there is another paper on the same subject, and they both arrived to the same conclusion, that there was a lack of coordination in messaging by authorities, which diminished the effects of non-medical interventions, mainly the idea of you have to stay home. We have contradictory messages, which might cause the impact on the labor market to be lessened with respect to what we have observed in other countries where lockdowns were enforced through more aggressive means. There are several studies that have started to identify the socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic shock. We know by now, because there is an increasing body of evidence, that in terms of the incidence of the virus, the more the incidence of the pandemic has been more aggressive on the more marginalized communities of the country. This is a robust result in terms of regional and national variation. So there have been studies that focus not only in the national scale, but also in Mexico City, and they find that the neighborhoods where are more precarious conditions of living are experienced, they were also the ones that were more heavily affected in terms of deaths and contagions. We also know that there was a large contraction of consumption, at least that was operated with credit or debit cards, recorded in the second and third quarter of last year. And this comes from a paper of Raymundo and Gerardo Esquivel, which identifies a contraction of around 16%. And we also know that the lockdown had a large impact on the labor market. And we know that, for example, formal employment was reduced by 5% with respect to what was observed before the lockdown, and it started to recover as the lockdown was lifted. The difference was that the men employment recovered faster than women. However, this result is only for the formal market, and in particular those who are registered at the Instituto Mexicano de Seguridad Social, which is the Social Security Institute of Mexico, and thus is not generalizable. And what we, or I in this case, try to go further is to analyze what happened in the whole labor market, and not only analyze employment, but also labor force participation and what happened in terms of the care work performed in the house. The data source that I'm going to use is the National Survey on Employment and Occupation, the NOE, which is a quarterly survey that recovers information on occupational status and several household characteristics, among them a series of questions on time allocation by members of the household. This allows us to analyze care work, and I define it as the time dedicated to household chores and taking care of another household member in general, which is the way it's asked in the survey. And the survey is representative for the population at the national and state levels for those that have at least 12 years old. Just to remind you, the legal age of work in Mexico is 15 years or older. The survey collection methods that I was telling you were changed during the lockdown. Particularly what happened, and this impacts our ability to assess what happened during the lockdown in the Mexican labor market, was that the in-person interviews that is the traditional collection method of this survey were suspended and they were replaced by telephone interviews. The problem with this switch is that, well, it wasn't planned. So in order to generate the sample for this period under the lockdown, what they did was to use the telephone numbers that they had from the first quarter sample and recontact them. And in case they were able to contact the respondents, then they were included into the sample. Thus, it is not a sample constructed to be representative at the national level, and it is constructed to be the ones who answer the phone call by the National Statistics Office. And they reach the national representativeness by adjusting the weights of each observation. Thus, the information that we have during the lockdown, it is not suitable for disaggregation analysis. And in particular, if we want to be more specific about analysis of the industry or at specific household compositions, it is not suitable to use the information that was gathered for the period of the lockdown, although the aggregated statistics are relatively comparable to the before and after information. Thus, I concentrate on the third and fourth quarters of 2020, which is the periods of time where the traditional survey method was recovered. Now, this crisis, in terms of, well, let me show you what are the aggregate indicators of the labor market in Mexico, particularly how they have been evolving and how is the shock affecting the labor market. We have a large drop in labor force participation as a consequence of the lockdown. And by the end of 2020, labor force participation for both men and women was recovering to the previous levels, but was still below the level observed before the pandemic. And just for you to have in mind, women labor force participation in Mexico is around below 50%, around 48%. And during the third quarter of 2020, it dropped to 40% of the all-female population. In terms of informality, and this kind of, well, it is a signal of the general effect of the impact, we do not see a change in terms of the composition of the labor market. So we do not see an increase on informality. Either it is defined as having an informal employment or having access to medical services, or those concentrated in the informal sector. In any of those indicators of informality, we see an increase. So this indicates a general shock in the labor market that affected both formal and informal employment. When we concentrate in specific subsamples of the population, we start to see different types of effects. So for example, in the case of mothers and fathers of children between 0 and 15 years old, we both see an impact in the third quarter, and the recovery is a bit faster for fathers than for mothers. And those who reside for seniors, we observe that they still remain outside the labor market with respect to what was occurring before the pandemic. And in the case of the unemployment rate, we see an increase in the unemployment rate as a consequence of the pandemic, but it's starting to diminish slowly. And we do not see a different incidence by gender. Now, these aggregate indicators tell us a story of a large impact in the labor market. If we are interested in analyzing how this impact differs by sex composition of the labor market, we are going to face a problem, which is that the crisis affected Mexico and the measures taken in the country were taken at the national level. Hence, it is very difficult to construct a comparison group that was not affected either by the policies or by the shock itself. And this is a challenge in terms of causal or statistical inference. And I use two approaches in order to try to gather what is the effect of the shock on women and if it is different from the effect on men And one of them is through the use of excess ratios, and the other one is a more traditional diff-in-diff approach. Excess ratios, probably you have become familiar with them during the pandemic because they are heavily used in medical research. We compare the value during the quarter that we're interested or the time period that we're interested in with a baseline value. And the way I construct this baseline value for the situation in the labor market is by taking the average on the number of persons or persons employed, persons who participate in the labor market or unemployed, depending on the indicator that I am interested in, for a specific quarter over the past 4 years. So this allows us to control or to take out the effects of the cyclical variation, and also to have a baseline value that is relatively simple to calculate and intuitive to interpret. We can make more complex estimations of the baseline through a time series approach, but the gain in terms of constructing the baseline is not that much compared to producing a simple average. What we observe when we take this approach is a large impact in the third quarter in terms of labor force participation. That was the point estimate is larger for women than for men, both in terms of labor force participation and employment, which means that the number, the hit on the number of women who participated in the labor market was larger. They decreased in about 4% in the total number of women in participating in the labor market with respect to the baseline, whereas the participation of men dropped in 2% of all men participating in the labor market. We observe a similar pattern in employment. However, the difference, as you can see in the confidence intervals, is not statistically significant between both groups. And when we compare with the fourth quarter, we start to see the effects of the recovery. Women are re-entering the labor market. In a way, it is not statistically, the difference between the baseline and the observed value in the fourth quarter is not statistically significant, and the same occurs in employment. When we analyze specifically the labor force participation of mothers and fathers, we observe that they still remain outside in the labor market compared to the baseline. And this can be linked to the situation in the schools that, as they are not functioning as usual, they rely on in-home instruction, thus preventing or apparently preventing parents to re-enter the labor market. This is also observed for those who co-reside with older people, although in this case we do observe recovery. Now, shifting to the difference approach that will allow us to gather more fine evidence. I will, for the sake of time, I will skip kind of the explanation of the estimator. But the idea in general is that we are comparing the past periods that we assume to be the control group for the current situation in the labor market, for the pandemic situation in the labor market, in the sense that, as we observed before, it was relatively stable before the pandemic hit, and thus that is kind of suggestive that it can act as a way to act as a control for the post-pandemic labor market, the one that already was affected by it. And this is the first regression that I'm going to estimate, which is the coefficient of interest is beta 3, which is the effect of 2020 and the third and fourth quarters, which are the treatment period. And I also estimated the heterogeneity by subpopulation groups using the triple difference estimator proposed by Woolrich. And these are the results. We observe a substantial drop in the probability of participation in the labor market for women, larger than men. So with respect to men, women are around 2 or 1.5% less likely to participate in the labor market. The effect for the total population is about 6%, which suggests us the grave dislocation that the pandemic was with respect to the situation before the pandemic in the Mexican labor market. However, although the probability of being in the labor market increased by the fourth quarter for the total population, this did not happen for women. So women are not re-entering the labor market at the same rate as men, and they are still have a lower probability of being in the labor market compared to men during the pandemic than, which is consistent with the international evidence in that sense. When we observe two subgroups that are of particular interest, which are men who coincide with care recipients, which are children of from 0 to 15 years old, seniors, and people with disabilities. And then we concentrate on mothers. We again see that they are less likely to participate in the labor market than the men who are in the same situation. So fathers of children between 0 and 15 years old are more likely to have re-entered the labor market than the mothers of the same children. And men who coincide with care recipients are, in the same way, more likely to be re-entering the labor market than women. Sorry. And in terms of employment, we see a very similar pattern, that there was a large dislocation for the total population, but that women are relatively being more affected than men, although in this case, the difference between men and women is not statistically significant at the 95%. And when we concentrate on mothers and women who coincide with care recipients, they are not less likely to be employed than men. And this suggests us that women who are exiting the labor market, what is happening in the labor market is not that women who are in the labor market are less likely to be employed, but that women are exiting the labor market completely at higher rates than men. And in terms of employment, those who participate there are no differences between men and women. And in terms of care work, and this kind of was the good news during the third quarter, and then it disappeared, that there was a reduction in the care work gap in terms of hours. So the gap is basically the amount of time that women spent in performing care work tasks compared to those that were spent by men, and the share by women decreased by an hour, about an hour during the third quarter, particularly by women. By mothers, it decreased about an hour, but that decrease in the inequality of care work disappeared by the fourth quarter, returning to the previous pattern. So this suggests that in the Mexican labor market, we are observing a very similar situation to what was observed in the developed countries, in the sense that women are exiting the labor market. We do not observe that there was a reduction in the inequalities of care work. And the size of the shock to the Mexican labor market was substantial, but it seems to be recovering, except for mothers of children, who remain outside the labor market at a higher, with a higher probability of being outside the labor market than men or fathers of the same children. And that's all from me. I think I finished on time.
Thanks, Luis. Very interesting, and I think very important question you're asking. Again, let's save the questions we have for a bit later. Yeah, I'm glad Raymundo is here with us to present. Raymundo, to present our joint paper with work in progress with Gerardo Esquivel. Raymundo will kick off the presentation, and I will then finish. So Dr. Raymundo Campos Vázquez, he has a PhD in economics from the University of California in Berkeley. He is professor at Colegio de México in Mexico City. Spent the last year or two with the Banco de Mexico. Has publications, a large number of publications. Actually, we heard yesterday he has increasing returns to scale in the American Economic Review, Oxford Development Studies, American Economic Journal, Economic Policy, and many others. He has won in 2018 the award of the Academy of Sciences, Research Award in Social Sciences, has written books on social mobility in Mexico, several. And his research has also been cited by several media outlets, such as The Economist, New York Times, El País. So glad you are here with us, Raymundo. We have 15 to 20 minutes, so we need someone to discipline us if we don't manage to do that ourselves. So maybe Barbara or Paulina, you can tell us when we don't.
Kristen, can you put the presentation?
Tell us after 15 minutes. Paulina, will you do that? Or should I? Okay.
Okay, I will put the presentation and switch the slides, okay? But that's not the first one. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So we're going to present a paper that we have been working the past months on remittances. So the title so far is Rescoping under a Global Shock and then Migrant Remittances and Household Spending during the COVID pandemic. So my co-authors are Christian Ambrosius and Gerardo Esquivel, who is at Banco de Mexico. We started this question because probably as you remember, last year when the pandemic started, there was a huge concern that remittances were facing a huge decline given the economic shock. So, for example, this is the World Bank was saying that there was going to be a sharp decline in remittances. But what happened in reality was a different story. And this is the next slide. What happened is that for some countries, there was a decline in remittances, but in the particular case for Mexico, as you can see, Mexico is like I hope you can see the color green, kind of green, dark green. And for Mexico, it didn't decline as much as in other countries. And then in other countries, it increased by a lot later on after the pandemic, after the pandemic started. So one can question this is what happened. Is this like formal or informal mechanisms? And there has been some research trying to analyze whether this is driven by a substitution from informal mechanisms, like just moving the money from one border to the other, in the case of Mexico, in cash, and now it's informal mechanism through the banking system. There is some research on that, but what we want to analyze is that maybe these patterns are driven by origin and destination conditions. And so this is what we want to test in this paper. The next, please. So what we want to do is basically analyze the case of Mexico, and probably, well, for the Mexicans here, probably you know, but maybe for the Germans in Germany, it's important to say this. I mean, Mexico was heavily hit by the pandemic. It has the second highest number of excess deaths after the US. If we see a graph on the support of government to the economy, Mexico is among, I mean, the support from the government is little to none in comparison to other countries. No? And at the same time, we have particular, the context here in Mexico is hugely relevant, is that it's basically the largest migration corridor in the world. We have 12 million Mexicans in the US. This represents around $40 billion in annual remittances. And so the big question that we want to answer here is that how remittances are affected by destination country or origin country condition. This is there is a huge literature here in development on whether remittances are driven by what happens in the destination country or in the origin country. So for example, if in Mexico it's a bad shock, then the migrants in the US know this and they are going to send more money because it's bad times here in Mexico. Otherwise, it's like bad times in the US where the migrants live and they cannot send money, and then that's the main determinant. So we want to separate and to analyze how important each channel is. And then the second important question that we want to analyze is, did remittances soften or worsen the impact of the crisis? So are they used as a risk coping mechanism in terms of household spending? So we're going to show the data we have in the next slides, and then I'm going to introduce the data because Christian later will only show you the methods and the results. So let me tell you as well the data we're using. So here we have the employment trends in Mexico and the US. In the left-hand side is the formal employment. So in Mexico, we have informal employment, that is employment that is not registered in the Social Security Administration in Mexico, and then formal employment that has all the Social Security benefits. So here is the formal employment relative to the previous year in 2020. And what we can see is a huge decline when the pandemic started in Mexico, that is in late March. And then April, May, we can see the big hit in employment. So we use formal employment here. This is important to say. This is data from the Social Security Administration in Mexico, basically because we can use this data at the municipal level. We have an employment survey that is representative at the state level, and we can use that. However, we cannot go into the detail at the municipal level, and that's why we use basically formal employment. On the right-hand side, we see US unemployment rates, and then we see how also as well at the start of the pandemic, we see a huge spike in terms of unemployment in the US. And what we're going to use is we're going to use this unemployment in the US at the state level and basically try to create a weighted unemployment for the migrants using the matrícula consular. The matrícula consular is this document that migrants in Mexico get from consulates and from the consulates in the US as an identification card. And in that identification card, we know the place of birth, so we can track where they are living in the US and where they are born in Mexico. So we calculate a weighted average of unemployment of these migrants according to the origin of these migrants. Okay, so and then the remittances are from Banco de Mexico, and the central bank has remittances basically every month, but every quarter you can have the remittances at the municipality level. So we use the municipality remittances information and also the state level information. So these, the remittances come from the central bank, and what we can see, as in the previous slide, is that we see a spike early on, and then we see a small decline, but basically it's an increase. We don't see a decline in remittances comparing 2020 with respect to 2019. And then what we want to analyze is whether these remittances, where they go, at the municipalities they go, or the states that the remittances go, how they affect household spending in terms of electronic payments. And then also from the central bank, we can have information on electronic payments, this point of sales, using debit cards and credit cards. And this information, we have this information basically by the state, and for large municipios, we have also this information. And then what we can see for the electronic payments is, again, as the pandemic started, we see a huge decline in spending, and then it recovers slowly. So we're going to mix and merge all this information to answer these two questions, whether remittances are important in terms of which channel is more important, the origin or the destination country effect. So we're going to find the effect of the elasticity of remittances with respect to origin and destination country shocks. And then later on, we analyze how remittances affect household spending during the pandemic. And then here for the econometric methods and the results, Christian will take over.
Okay, thanks, Raymundo. So the first question, so we have these two questions and all the data that Raymundo explained to you. So the first question is elasticity. So how do they respond to origin and destination country shocks? And so we have two hypotheses there, which are quite intuitive, actually. So either you have a more severe employment shock, and then you get more remittances because of what is very much discussed in the literature, the altruism of migrants, they care for the family. And it has been shown in many empirical studies that remittances respond to the needs of their families behind in case of disasters, crises, etc. So, and then the second one, but this is, remittances are also determined or affected by conditions migrants face at destination. So there's also an issue of their capacity to send. So this is the second hypothesis. They could both be true. Right? So a larger increase in unemployment rates where they live should be associated with a decrease in remittances. So we test these two hypotheses using data at the administrative level, either states in Mexico, 32 states, or some 300 of the 300, 400 largest municipalities we use in that research. So the first hypothesis is more straightforward to answer, because Banco de Mexico provides data on remittances at the level of municipalities, inflow every quarter. So at quarterly level, you can measure like how many formal remittances enter the municipality. And we can cross this with the employment shock in each quarter. So then the other issue is how to measure how the unemployment at destination affects remittances. So what we do there is what Raymundo also already explained to you. We use the exposure to unemployment at destination. So we use these matriculas consulares, consular documents. We have birth and residence, so we can approximate corridors, and then not all municipalities are exposed, or all states exposed the same way to destination country shocks. Right? And these corridors are pretty stable over time. So we use this indicator, this weighted exposure to unemployment in the US, based on the portfolio of migrants that each state has in the US. Right? So I leave this picture because I think it makes the idea of that indicator clearer. We have US states and unemployment rates in US states in the second quarter 2020, when the pandemic crisis hits. Right? The darker the shade, the higher was unemployment in these states. So Nevada is quite an outlier here. Probably people don't go much to casinos in Las Vegas in the pandemic. So they had a very strong increase in unemployment. But in all the East Coast, also the East Coast states are darker, which don't see that much. So the idea here is that Mexican states that are darker are those states who have more migrants living in US states with a strong increase in unemployment in 2020. Right? This is how we measure destination country shock. So, and what we see is, so this is the correlation at the level of the 32 Mexican states, well, 31 excluding the city of Mexico. And the correlation between change in remittances between the first and the second quarter on the vertical axis, and on the left-hand side, formal employment in Mexico. How much did formal employment drop? Quintana Roo here is the state in Mexico that was most affected in terms of formal employment loss. Tourism played an important role here, but we don't see a systematic pattern here between remittances and formal employment in Mexico. Exposure to US unemployment, the indicator that we saw on the previous slide, that's shown here, but we do see that those states whose migrants were more exposed to unemployment increase in the United States saw a less favorable pattern in remittances. So they received comparatively less remittances. So Puebla, for example, the state with a lot of migrants in New York. New York was, well, Luis can tell us, was very affected, or one of the first states heavily affected by the pandemic. So Puebla was more affected in terms of exposure to unemployment and received fewer remittances compared to other states. Right? So this is what we see in as a first picture. And we can also test this more. We test this more formally using a regression, where you can use remittances inflow at the level either of states or alternative municipalities during 2020 for every quarter. So we have 4 quarters we can observe, and using both the employment shock in Mexico and the employment shocks in the US. And if we use all variables at logs, we can also directly interpret this in terms of elasticity, like a percentage change in the explanatory variable. How much does this translate into percentage changes in remittances? Using controlling for time fixed effects and unit fixed effects. So what we see is that indeed, as we saw already in that first picture of the correlation, US unemployment exposure, more exposure to unemployment in the US translate into fewer remittances. And using only the first 2 quarters with an elasticity of 1, like 1% increase in unemployment, 1% decrease in remittances. This kind of fades out over the entire year. So it's weaker, it's not really driven by that strong increase in unemployment in the second quarter of 2020. Mexican employment doesn't matter that much, or at least not very systematically. So we see some effect, as we expected, over the entire year, but it's really driven by one state, Quintana Roo, a strong outlier. So we take the state out, we don't have any significant effect anymore. And we don't have an effect at the level of, we don't see an effect at the level of municipalities, but we see the same, we have basically the same coefficient for the exposure to unemployment. So in summary, so we confirm the first hypothesis. We don't confirm the first. Origin conditions do not affect remittances, that strongly, but destination country conditions do affect remittances. Right? So, and then the second part of the paper is, so does that translate into spending during the pandemic, and how? We expect consumption in Mexico to drop less in places that received large amounts of remittances, and vice versa. Right? So now we look at how did remittances affect spending, electronic payments with credit or debit card. So we have a challenge here. So I'm going to, don't have that many time left, so I'm going to be quick about that. So we can't really just measure the correlation between inflow and remittances and spending and interpret this coefficient in causal terms, because, well, for one, there's reverse causality, because it can also be that spending drops and then remittances respond. So this is our first hypothesis. So then we can't really interpret this in terms of causal effect of remittances on spending. In the other issue, as we have a measurement error, because probably we had this mobility restriction had some effect on the formalization, and then we overestimate remittances. So we measure too many remittances, and also that makes it difficult to estimate a causal effect. So what we do is we isolate exogenous changes in remittances. So we take only this part of remittances that responds to the exogenous change. And the exogenous change in this case is the quasi-random exposure to unemployment increase in the US. So what we did in the first part, the second hypothesis. So we first measure, we take the predicted remittances, we use exposure to US unemployment to predict remittances, and then we take that predicted part of remittances. And this allows us to isolate the exogenous component and then estimate the second step results as a causal effect of remittances on spending. Right? And there are some conditions related to this. So we have a pretty strong instrument. And the assumption here is that there's only this channel we suggest. Right? So only unemployment affects remittances and remittances affects spending, and there are no other channels that could explain these results. So the second step then is we use predicted remittances and explain transactions, electronic transaction, and using the same unit in time fixed effects we had used in all of the other regressions, and take the logged amount of payments and the logged amount of remittances. So, and we see that effectively there's a strong effect of the inflow of remittances on spending with the coefficient above 1 during the first 2 quarters of the year, which is also when the effect of the employment shock is strongest, and this instrument is well identified. The effect is a bit weaker when we go to the municipality level, so it kind of 0.7 instead of 1.2 or 1.1. And again, you can interpret this as elasticity, like a percentage change in the inflow of remittances and the percentage change in electronic payments. So remittances did matter. So we can either, so the more remittances declined, the more spending declined. Well, there's an additional channel we can confirm like how remittances affected spending and the severity of the crisis in Mexico. Consumption dropped less in places that received larger amounts of remittances. So the conclusion from this paper is, first, remittances responded mainly to the conditions in the US, much less to the conditions in Mexico. And the broader conclusion or the broader message is in a way that, well, remittances don't work that well as a mechanism of protection or insurance if you have a global crisis. So if you have the assumption in much of the literature on the economics of remittances builds on the idea that the north or the destination country is always a source of stability. So if you have a systematic global shock, this doesn't work so well, and you could easily have a pro-cyclical effect of remittances and make the crisis even worse because you have an additional vulnerability via remittances. So then also with make an additional observation is that, so that what we see here is based on meso level data, kind of at odds with the aggregate national trends. And that observation that remittances didn't fall that much, although resilient. In Mexico, they even increased. So this is also, we see that it did respond to destination country. So most likely we also see a formalization effect there, and that remittances were not that resilient as macro data suggests, but they were much more vulnerable or exposed to destination country conditions. Right? Thanks for listening. Now, Raymundo, something you want to add to the conclusions?
Oh, perfect. We can move on. Thank you. Great.
Thanks.
Well, we already have a couple of questions written in the chat, a couple in Spanish and a couple in English. So
okay. Just recalling that we wanted to take 3 questions in a row.
Good.
But we still have quite some time, and you are okay. If you have a question, just raise your hand or write in a chat so Paulina can take notes.
Christian, we still see your screen. A nice picture of a place I know well, but maybe it's better to see our faces.
Well, I would like to begin with the questions. First, we have 2 questions addressed to Dr. Fritz. First one is made by Fernando. It's in Spanish, so I hope my translation is accurate enough. Here it says that as members of IMF or World Bank, is Mexico obligated to use credit lines and other programs that are in previous agreement with this organization, even though actual government is not interested in using these kind of policies? That's the first question. Second one is made by Rogelio Madureño. This one is in English. Here it says, hi everyone, great presentation by Dr. Fritz. Question, do you know if there is information available how much of these funds are dollar-denominated funds? Of course, it might change depending on the fund, but it would be interesting to see the participation of the US dollar within these funds. Thank you. We have 2 questions directly to Luis. So if it's okay with you, can I read them both so he can take notes? Is that okay? Okay.
Yep.
So here it says, first one is again by Fernando. It's in Spanish, so I mean, I think Luis has no problem with it, but anyway, I'm translating. We have data about the effects of COVID-19 regarding occupation and employment. Are they considering informal employment that could be even bigger than formal one, where there is in this informal employment we can find the most vulnerable population, which were forced to continue working, and they had like the biggest increase in contagious and death. Is this included in your study? And next one is from Pedro Javier Torres. Luis, do you know how these results contrast with those presented in the nCovid developed by the Equide? Have you considered complementing your data with this database? And we have a third one for Luis. Here it says, is there a purpose by using a medical intervention and not medical attention in the speech? And well, that's what we have all written in the chat. Thank you. And we also have somebody that asks to make a personal question to Christian. Luis is useful.
Yeah, I think there are more than 3.
Yeah,
maybe
next round.
Take a break, and then if you have questions or you want to ask them personally, just
sure.
write so in the chat, right? Or raise your arm and then.
Christian, who should start?
Oh, I think the first questions were to you, Barbara, right?
Okay. Okay, so we go in the order of the presentations as the questions appeared like that.
I think yeah.
Okay, so great questions. Thank you. First, Fernando. IMF or World Bank credit lines are something which are offered by these institutions, and countries have to request them. The IMF neither the IMF nor the World Bank nor a regional fund can force any country to take in credit lines. So it's up to the governments to go or not. We argue usually that countries might enter into a situation where they have no choice. But if you look at the regional or at the global financial safety net, you see that at least some countries have the choice to go to the IMF or to a swap line or to a regional fund. That's one issue. And second issue also is that countries might just refuse to go, like Cuba is in acute balance of payment problems, or Turkey or other countries, but they reject to go to the IMF and do not find other solutions, so they kind of muddle through. But it's an issue which it's really interesting to dig more into. Rogelio, no sé, sorry. Okay. About the currency denomination. For regional funds, this is mostly denominated in US dollar, because the principle of regional financial arrangements is to join foreign exchange reserves and then to lend to member countries when they are in need. There are some exceptions. The IMF sometimes gives lending in one of the regional currencies, etc., but most of it just complies with the dominance of the US dollar. When we go to swaps, then of course the provision of swaps depends on the countries providing the swaps. So we already also here, because we have unlimited swaps between, for example, the Federal Reserve and Central Bank, in these terms, the dollar and the euro would be dominating, but we have a strong participation, for example, of swaps denominated in renminbi, because the share of People's Bank of China swaps is rather large. Okay, I hope I could answer these questions adequately.
Thanks, Dr. Fritz.
Okay, I think that...
Luis, could you weigh in, please?
I know, maybe go with Luis first.
Yeah, it was Luis' turn.
Okay. So about the first question on the formal and informal market, yes, my analysis considers both the informal and formal employment, and that's the reason why I use this national employment survey instead of the administrative records that are, for example, the basis of the work by Christian and Raymundo. And as I show you, the informality rates, either if you define it as employments that have access to Social Security, or the official definition of informal employment, which considers that criteria and other, let's say, benefits associated to having an employment, being available to the worker, and or the more traditional definition of informal sector, which is small productive units with few employees and no administrative records. Neither of those rates actually increased during the pandemic. That does not mean that the number of informal workers decreased, but that the decrease was at the same magnitude that the total exits from the market, which is why the rate doesn't change. So that's kind of an indicator that the shock was generalized both to the formal and informal sectors of the economy, and that is an important difference when considering this crisis with respect to other ones, such as the one in 2008, 2009. As usually the informal sector, it's kind of a escape valve for the loss of employment in the formal sector. Here we see a loss that occurred and in the total labor market as a whole. Now, with regards to the data on the end COVID, I think that well, first of all, they use a different definition of unemployment in the sense that I use the official definition of employment, which is basically if you are looking for a job during the past week and you're not employed, then you are considered to be unemployed. And they add to that those who are discouraged from keep looking to work, which are people who are, when you ask the survey to them, they respond, no, I'm not looking for a job, but if a job is available, I will take it. And that leads to count as unemployment part of the population that under a more traditional framework will be considered to be outside of the labor market. That's the reason why you might find several differences in the unemployment numbers that I present with respect to what they calculate. It's because they are adding people who are outside the labor market in that sense. And I haven't considered joining the two data sets, particularly because the sampling strategy from the ENOE and from the ENCOVID are very different. Whereas the ENOE is a household survey conducted with in-person interviews, and ENCOVID is a telephone survey, which makes it comparable to other surveys produced by the National Statistics Office during this period, and with a subsample of the ENOE, but not with the whole sample. And I think that that is a point that we have to have in mind when trying to cross data sources, particularly not administrative records, but things that come from different surveys, is the way the information is recovered, as it might not be, you might be conflating different types of biases by mixing sources. So that's the reason why I don't mix the information available in the COVID with the ENOE. And the last question is why I use the term non-medical intervention instead of attention. Well, it has to do with the type of interventions that were made in Mexico, in the sense that as yesterday, the presentation by Evarseo was very clear, the main intervention in Mexico was a communication strategy, in the sense that the idea was to convince people not to go out of the house, to have the sanitary measures as recommended, and those are per se non-medical, and they are not attention. They are interventions in the public sphere by the policymaker trying to exert an incentive to perform certain behaviors. So that's why I use the term non-medical intervention. I think it's more precise of what actually happened in Mexico.
Thank you very much, Luis. I have one question in the chat addressed to Christian and Raymundo's presentation. Do you mind if I read it? And then you can make your questions personally. Is that fine? Okay, thanks. Here it says that is the vaccination program in the US related to the results of your inquiry? Here it says because there is almost 100% of percentage of coverage in vaccination from people 18 and older. So is that important in the result of your investigation? That's what the Fernando is asking. And then we have a question from Luis to Christian. So if you want to make your question personally, please go ahead.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, it seems like an amazing paper. I'm eager to read it. And I have two concerns and questions. One of them has to do with the registry on the Matrícula Consular, because do we know if there is a bias on immigration status and getting the Matrícula Consular? Because it might be the case that, and this is coming from my experience as a migrant in New York, when I went to get the Matrícula Consular, the people who were at the consul's office are mostly documented migrants. And you will expect those migrants to have higher, or well, by definition, those type of migrants, if they have work visas, they can access certain, well, the residents can have access to the type of interventions that were implemented by the US government. So the idea is that if you are a resident, then you can have access to the Social Security benefits and the unemployment insurance. particularly the interventions that were made during the pandemic. But if you are non-documented, then you do not have access to those type of measures. So that will explain why a rise in unemployment in a particular state did not lead to an increase in remittances. Because the narrative that you see in the media is that, oh, well, they are sending more money because they got the stimulus checks. But that's only for a specific type of visa. Student visa, for example, is not receiving those type of stimulus. But if you're a worker, you can receive those type of stimulus. So that will be an interesting thing to check. Like if we know if there is a bias in who gets the matrícula consular, then that will help us to understand the effect. And the second thing that, and this is more a suggestion that might be of interest, is to check if there is an effect of the reduction on unemployment benefits that are occurring in several US states. If you have been following the news in the US, several Republican state governments have decided to lift the mandates extending the unemployment benefits and reducing the time they are available for those on unemployment. And that gives you a natural variation in who gets access to these type of benefits and who doesn't. And it's based mostly on political leaning of the governor of your state. So the benefits at the federal level are expected to be phased out in September, but since this May, there have been several states that have cut out benefit access. So that will be interesting to see if that affects the pattern of remittances from Mexico, from the US to Mexico.
We have a last question to Dr. Ambrosius. Dr. Fritz, do you want to weigh in? And then we can do like the next round, please.
Yeah, quick question. So great paper you presented, great use of data. I learned a lot. I have a bit technical questions if you really see what you want to see. One is that it's great to use the matrícula consular to localize migrants and their families. But is unemployment in this crisis really a question of localization? And isn't it much more a question of sectoral distribution? And we saw in Monroy's presentation that sectoral distribution has to do a lot with, for example, gender distribution. So how much did you get? And the second point is maybe an ignorance of mine. I thought the physical carrying of remittances over the border from the US to Mexico had decreased dramatically. How much, what's the role still of that, and how much you would really overestimate remittances now that the borders have been closed? Thanks.
Okay, Raymundo, lots of questions to us. Should I start and then you complement, or do you want to?
Well, I'll try to complement, but most of them were about the matrícula consular, and you're the expert on that. But I'll try to help you
Okay.
if you need something, but I don't think so.
Okay. No, I mean they're all excellent questions. So I think some of them don't have such a easy answers, and some have like limitations of possibility of what data can give you. Like the first question, vaccination. I'm not sure if I understood in the end. Well, first of all, it's all what we do with 2020. So there was no vaccination during the period we study. So it doesn't really. Also, I wouldn't know really how that would be related, other than maybe people are vaccinated and can quicker go back to work, right? But in any case, so 2020 there was no vaccination. Also, the stimulus checks, well, at least the stimulus checks you have now, well, that wouldn't enter 2020, and all the payments, well, it wasn't important unemployment payments in the second quarter of 2020. So well, Luis raised a lot of issues, I think that are important and valid concerns. And well, the answer is in a way of, well, practical answer is like, what is, I think some of these concerns are, well, valid, but probably, well, I would argue not necessarily totally questioning what we're doing. So there might be an issue between documented and undocumented, who gets or who asks for matricola consular, and there's of course also reflects like the population you have and you estimate. So you could in principle check how much there's correlation in the data. So see, does the matricola consular really represent foreign-borns, Mexican foreign-borns without their residence, and see how well that matches? Well, studies have done that, so it kind of does capture relatively well the distribution of the population. It could still be that you have states where you have much more documented than undocumented migrants. So this is relatively difficult, really, to answer. So maybe there's a way of controlling for some of the things you mentioned. Maybe there's a way of controlling for shares of documented or undocumented, or payments which happened in certain quarters. But I'm not sure that we have a, well, maybe Raymundo wants to jump in there. I'm not sure we have rather than believing that, it doesn't really question the general idea, and there's a correlation between, well, you have migration corridors and then also document population that at some moment becomes documented is still correlated with the undocumented population. So, well, it wouldn't be that different. Okay, comment by Barbara. So does it really matter that much, the unemployment rate as such, but it's more about sectors and services? Probably it is. We can't really. So this also explains why some states had higher unemployment rates, because they are stronger in certain sectors and certain services. Right? Many of the migrants work in service sectors, so the group we are interested in. So no matter in which state they are, they would probably be in the more vulnerable sectors. And we can't really, so what we can have is unemployment rates at the level of states at the quarterly level, but it doesn't get that disaggregated. It is disaggregated. At the annual level, you could have specific unemployment rates by self-identified ethnic groups. So if you go to the annual level, you can know the Latin population unemployment rates. So that gets you closer to the population you are interested in, but it's not possible to have that at the quarterly level. But still you have, well, migrants that are generally in service sectors a lot, and then living in states where they were more affected. So they kind of think also works in identifying the effect. Regarding, can there still be formalization, or how much is there of formalization? So I think it's true that it's not that much money anymore, but you still have, and I'm not sure of how much of a bias there could be, but still people travel, and when they travel, they take money with them. And I think even the spike in March, so that was when it began, and many people planned their Easter holidays. And although my guess would be that if you go back for Easter, you take money with them, and then if you can't travel, you send the money instead by banks or money transfer operators. So I guess there's still room for formalization.
Yeah, I would only add, I mean, according to the Banco de Mexico data, the informal channels are very small. Of course, we can debate whether this measurement is correct or not, but according to the central bank data, this is 1% or so. We do take into consideration this informal channel, and in the regressions we control for the distance to the diaspora, no, the distance to the border, and then basically the results do not change basically when we include these controls. So I think it's important, but we don't find that changes a lot. And then for Luis, I think I mean, I think the first concern would it's I don't know, but I need to think a little bit more on that. But I think it favors us in the sense that it would be a lower bound what we're finding. If what you are saying is correct, the elasticity should be much larger. But let's think about that. And then the second question, yeah, it's a great idea. I think for a different paper, but a great idea. Because I mean, the study is only for 2020, given the huge shock in the economy, no? So we're going to stop there. But I think what we are saying is for 2021, and it can provide a great source of identification for similar channels. Okay.
Okay, Paulina, you have the list of questions. We have time for another round, I think. So in theory, we have like 7 minutes.
Well,
maybe
actually,
we could just ask all the questions that are left.
Actually, Dr. Fritz would like to address a question to Luis, and I think that was the last question.
No?
Oh, no, sorry, it was my bad. Well, I think that there are no more questions in the chat, so if anybody would like to address a question, well, we can actually have a little time for that.
If there's nobody else on the list.
No, we have no questions left.
Okay. So I would make, well, one question to Barbara. So, well, you mentioned the possible storm, right? So, and I don't know, do you think it's possible that what you treated as a liquidity problem could turn into a solvency problem? And what would be, so what is what does your glass crystal ball tell you about the future? And are the mechanisms that you have been talking about then adequate? Do you think there's a risk of this turning into a solvency crisis and then treating it as a liquidity crisis is maybe not a sufficient response or not the adequate? And then questions to Luis, which I think is a fascinating, very important paper. So in the end, there are like two reasons, right, why women would be more affected by the child caring issue and the type of jobs they are doing. They might be in sectors that are more exposed. And I understand that you argue that the child, the caring burden weighs more, matters more than the type of jobs women are doing, right? So I wonder, so I don't know the data you use that well, they know it. So how much could you go into details and exploring further which were responses of households in responding to that? Because I guess there's also a lot of heterogeneity within the group of women, right? So there's an intersection of gender with class. So you have households where you have larger families, and then I heard a lot of grandmothers taking over the burden of caring for the children. And so if it's possible, I don't know if it's possible with the data you have, but I think there are a lot of building on this finding, a lot of further questions and how exactly did households respond to that burden in terms of, like, schools have been closed the entire year. Usually women take care of that. But this, I guess, works very similar in rural households with large families than in urban middle classes. And well, I think an important intersection with class also in that. So I don't know if it's possible to say something about that, but I think it would be fascinating if it would be possible to explore more that heterogeneity within responses.
Should I start, Christian? Okay, thanks a lot. Well, the crystal ball, the famous crystal ball. Well, it's about, it's an insecure future. This is what we know. But what we know is that there is a big lack of middle income development finance, so that many countries have gone to global markets, even frontier markets. Poorer countries like the Central American countries have been opening up to global financial markets, which in the past always have provided finance in a rather cyclical manner, in a pronounced cyclical manner. So we have an increasing number of countries which would suffer from a drowning of. As I showed, for the provision of liquidity, so that the IMF and the other elements could come of the global financial safety net could come under stress if too many countries are requesting liquidity at the same time. That's one issue. And if countries in liquidity need do not get liquidity, then the situation can worsen very quickly, and a liquidity problem shift towards a solvency problem, because then everybody gets extremely nervous and all creditors are running away and people are leaving the country and taking their capital away, which then swoops into a solvency crisis. For the solvency crisis, which might come up, we still have an enormous lack of not only schemes. The scheme to provide debt reduction and debt prolongation for very poor countries is very small and restricted to the very poor countries, and many of them, even a little bit below, above that threshold, are not covered. Emerging market countries, and we still lack, since the 80s and the 90s, there's a discussion of a sovereign insolvency mechanism, and we do not do that. We do not have that, and we have more and more private creditors, which are more and more difficult to be coordinated in a case a country gets insolvent. So there might be mess coming up, but maybe we are lucky that countries muddle through and get a bit more of growth before global markets get drying out. So let's see.
So I guess it's my turn. About your question, Christian. I think that based on the evidence that we have for the effects on employment at the aggregate level and the sectoral level, so part of it has to do with the fact that the sectors where usually are, or where women are more frequently employed, are also the ones that have suffered most during the crisis. That is a result that I don't have in this paper, but I have in another paper, which is already published, that where you observe the largest gap of employment are basically, with respect to what you were observing before the crisis, are in the sectors in the service industry, and particularly those where are, for example, household workers, the food industry, the restaurants and food preparation industry, and other sectors of that kind that require physical presence. And those are also sectors where women are more frequently employed. So the fact that those sectors aren't recovering as fast as the rest of the economy, for example, manufacturers, that certainly has an effect on why we observe women remaining outside the labor market more frequently than men. About the effect of household composition on the distribution of care work, that's an interesting question. I didn't show those results. I have several analyses on the effect that the presence of another woman in the household, for example, has on the amount of care work that is performed by the one that is analyzed. And you observe that more women in the household leads to lower probability of being outside the labor market. So it seems that yes, if you have more people in the household who are assigned to perform care work, then the effect of the crisis on your probability of employment is lower than if you don't have them. But yeah, I agree with you that it will be interesting to dig more into the determinants of who exited and who didn't exit in the labor market. I think that well, that's work for another paper using the panel of the ENOE for 2020. But in this case, I'm not dealing with exactly those type of questions now, because as you correctly point out, there are a lot of questions that arise from this original result.
Okay, thanks. I think there are a lot of questions related to the pandemic that we are still asking or just starting to provide some answers. Well, we're coming to the end, I think, of our seminar. So I think thanks a lot to all of them. Well, for me, it has been a very nice way of closing. Well, almost, I still have a seminar to finish, but almost closing my stay here at the university. We're returning to Berlin in 3 weeks. And well, I'm looking forward to seeing friends and going to the lakes and everything, but also I'm leaving with a heavy heart here in Mexico, and the UNAM has given me a lot. So, well, many are not here, but it's maybe a good opportunity to say thanks to a few people. No? The UNAM has been always there at the faculty, giving me all the support. So Lorena Rodriguez, Eduardo Vega, and also here at the postgraduate studies department, Benjamin Garcia, who is here with us. So they gave me a place at the knowledge field of economic development and had trust in me in giving classes there for their students. And so I appreciate that a lot, and that you have always been there and with open doors and giving me all the support that I needed. Right? And also Hideo helped with the seminar too, and Luis Gómez Oliva, who is not here with us, but I'm always also indebted to him, and all of the other people and the administrative stuff. So I think it's important just to say that. And the AAD isn't here either, but of course I owe them a lot too. And Paulina, who has been here helping with the seminar, of course, and that's also good. And in my classes too. So it's good to have someone where you can just hand over things and you know that it's going to work. So, so I don't want to make it long. Like one of the best things here at UNAM have been the students, I think. So it's an institution that has an enormous richness in terms of the students they have, extremely talented and motivated, and this is something I'm going to miss. And well, yeah, some students who took 2 hours drives to go to a class. So this means like 4 hours driving for a 3-hour class. So I think that this tells you a lot about the motivation they have. And usually if I had to reschedule it, if I couldn't attend a class, usually I had to reschedule instead of skipping this. And I think it tells a lot about like the kind of students that the UNAM has. Which I'm going to miss when I'm going back to Berlin. So thanks to all of you for being here. And well, I learned a lot during the 2 days. And well, hope to see you soon on other occasions. Right?
Let me have very quick closing words too. I also learned quite a lot the last 2 days, and I'm really glad to see how you build a network in around with highly talented and great economists providing very fresh and very up-to-date and highly relevant research to understand better what is happening in this current crisis. And I also can tell you that we are looking forward to having you back in Berlin, including the students. So welcome back soon, Christian. Good to have you back here. And thanks for putting up this seminar, which was great.
Okay, thanks.
So, goodbye to everybody. It was a pleasure to share this event with you. And I hope very much we keep in contact.
Okay, thanks to all of you. If you want to, there's a chat. So I think we said in the beginning, but if you need something or you want, we could share slides and papers that are available with you if you leave your email in the chat, and then Paulina takes note and we can send them. So we did that yesterday. So please leave your name in the chat and we save the chat, and then we.
And I can share the slides with in the Blackboard of the course Finance Development. So the students from Finance